Welcome to the Australian Property Investment Podcast with your host, Aaron-Christie David. Each episode, we ask an expert to share their key insights for aspiring investors to make confident property choices.
G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Australian Property Investment Podcast. My name is Aaron-Christie David, founder and mortgage broker at Atelier Wealth. Each episode, we try to unpack a lot of FAQs, so frequently asked questions that our clients ask us, and we're trying to pick the brain of an industry expert, what we call best in breed in a particular area. And today I'm joined by Munzurul Khan. I'm going to call you accounting royalty is the name I'm going to give you. The accountant to property investors. I know you've been featured heavily on Smart Property Investment, and you know your reputation precedes you, Munzurul, as one of those go-to experts when it comes to accounting and it comes to investing in property. For those that don't know, Munzurul is the principal at Keshab Chartered Accountants. And today, Munzurul, we're going to do two parts. And the first part that I really want us to go through is a little bit about the economy. So I probably want to maybe just take a step back before we do that and say, for those that aren't aware about the Munzurul Khan story in a nutshell, what's been, I guess, your background into building Keshab and where the business now is today, because you run a thriving business as well. Yeah,
Mate, absolutely. It's an absolute privilege to be here, Aaron, and thank you for inviting. The background is that I go back all the way to 1993.
I'm not going to give away your age, my friend. You still look great.
All the way to 1993. And then we came in Australia as a first generation migrants, and my parents sort of came over and so probably the story of many of the migrants, sort of first generation with hardly about 2,000 Australian dollars is all we had. And still remember in day one is that we paid 4 weeks of rent and 2 weeks of advance payment of mortgage. And we looked back and we said, well, we've got less than $1,000. There is no employment. I was 16 years old at that stage, and my brother was hardly in year one. So my father was the only hunter, so to speak. So that's how we started. But it's a beautiful country, right? It is an absolutely beautiful country. It's a country of privilege.
One of the best countries to live, that's for sure. Yeah.
Right, absolutely beautiful country. So my accounting background is about 26 years that I've been in the practice. So I started with a couple of small practice and then moved into BDO. BDO is fifth largest. I was there about 6.5 years, moved into PwC. PwC is the largest, about 4.5 years. Started Keshab all the way back in 2008, 2009. Wow. Day one, it was fundamentally myself, and rolled forward after about 12, 13, 14 years now, is that we look back and we've been privileged. We've got 4 offices and 50-odd members and 12 partners. So we've been very, very, very blessed.
Incredible. I mean, you make it sound like since 2008 to now has been a breeze in business. And I mean, everyone knows in business that it's a roller coaster, right? And I mean, looking at your building your practice, for example, it's very much like, say, building a property portfolio. It's a roller coaster journey. And I guess you've probably had some wonderful clients. And I guess amongst your clients has been the team at Smart Property Investment. So anyone that listens to the Smart Property Investment podcast, you know, you've been featured on there. So how did you, I guess, make that transition to almost specializing or becoming the expert in property investment, mate?
Amazing how you ask that. If you ask to anyone who's sort of being privileged, I suppose, where some of the things that have worked out is that in hindsight, you can always look through and say, wow, some of the things worked out. But in day one, when you start, is that it's never a master plan, right? Yeah. In day one, it's never a master plan. I still remember in day one when I started my practice, all my objective was a certain level of revenue and to reach there over a period of time. And the time frame was about 10 years. And somehow we got there in about 2.5 years. Nice. And I said, well, bugger, dreams are there not to be ever touched, right? That's what the dreams are. Yeah. That you always go for the dreams as such. So we realized at that stage that perhaps the sky is the limit and perhaps it's your imagination that you sort of extend. Aaron, some of the fundamental principles that we started in day one and still whenever we do get a chance, we remind ourselves is that to us, life is all about contribution. That is, it's all about contributing as much as we can. If I'm sitting into any level of association and funding sort of comes in first in the mind, it doesn't work. Yeah. It's all about this value proposition. So you do your absolute very best with the best of the integrity that one can, always play straight bat. Never to say that we know everything, which we don't.
Yeah.
Never to say that perhaps we never make any errors. Unfortunately, at times we do.
Okay.
But always to take the responsibility attached to it. And very often what we found is that when we stayed brutally, I suppose, honest to our own level of integrity and values, and then you bring in the hard work, that over a period of time it sort of works out. So you're right. I mean, I look back in day one, mate, and in day one I still remember that our top line revenue was about 15,000 and our rent, yearly rent was about 35,000. Right.
That's the start of a great startup.
I said, well, that doesn't work. Right. That's how we started. And we had trials and error, right? Yeah. There are many things that in day one that we tried, year 1, year 2, year 3, and some worked out. But we looked through and we sort of said some of the things, perhaps it hasn't worked out very well. Now, property side of it is that it sort of also came in to some extent as a chance, in the sense that, yes, I'm been investing all the way back from 1999 that I'm sort of investing. But when I started the practice as an accountant and with sort of few properties on the side as sort of personal passion and hobby. I still remember that one of my clients says that, Munzurul, that's what you seem to be doing. You're doing quite a bit on the property investment and you got to start present some of those things to the audience. And I've listened to her and I started speaking a bit more. And then we realized that, as we call it, the great Australian dream, it does exist.
Yeah, nice. Excellent. I mean, you mentioned there that you started investing in 1999. Is that correct?
That's right, mate. That's right.
So let's kind of play it forward a little bit. Yeah. And so you've got the 2003 boom, so that kind of boom run that we had just kind of post-Olympics, for example, and then you go forward to the GFC. Then you kind of come out of that, we rebounded out of that, and then you had a little run there, 2011, 14, and then it dropped off maybe 17, 18, and here we are on the tail going through a pandemic. And the property market's gone absolutely bonkers, right? That type of roller coaster journey for you, and this is where we want to have a chat about the economy, where property kind of fits into that based on your experience and based on you looking at historic trends as well, right? So take us on that journey that you have had. And I guess the next question to that is crystal balling, like what happens with the property market and where do we go to from here off the back of such record growth?
Beautiful. Absolutely great question. And there's a whole lot of different element of this question, right? So maybe we tackle the first part of that question, which is the history. And then we sort of go back to the second part of the question, that what does history tell us and what sort of some of the predictions, so to speak. You know, it's amazing. My first loan, I still remember that first loan, my interest rate was about 5.99%. And this was back in 1999, right? And yes, inflation was well within reason at that stage. But when you look back about 20 odd years ago, that dollar used to go a lot more. And 5.99 was the interest. And then I've seen the interest rate going up to 8 and 9 and so, and then I've seen the interest rate going down as well.
And my parents say, well, we had an interest rate like 15%. And
exactly.
A half leads for no one. So,
Exactly. So I think the first thing is that when I sort of look back, you're right. I mean, when you use the word roller coaster as such, it's an amazing journey of cycles. And if we look through the cycle, we can sort of say that, yes, there is sort of ups and downs with the cycle. But if we break down the cycle, we sort of say that there are different cycles in between different states as well. So it's not necessarily that, say, New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland, for argument's sake, that they all had the similar sort of a cycle. So I'll give you examples. Say 1999 to 2003, that when I just started buying, is that New South Wales was doing well. And 2003 was sort of that peak at that point of time. And I remember that Queensland at that stage, no one would buy any property in Queensland, right? I mean, why would you buy in Queensland?
I think that's where investors' hearts got broken, wasn't it? In Queensland,
in 1996 to 1998. So and this is why the elderly people sort of who remembers that the old, where people used to get flown away back in Queensland and shown some of those properties and being sold, few of those, and then flown back in the same day. So that was in 1995, 96, 98. So the price was it sort of took quite a bit of hit in Queensland. So no one buys in Queensland in sort of early 2000. And then I look back into 2002, 2003, is that some of the New South Wales properties, is that the way they increased is that the gross return in 2003 or so was hardly about 2.5%. And then you look back and you sort of say, how does that make sense? The inflation, while the target is between 2 to 3%, is that if you have a gross return of, say, 2.5%, means that in real terms, term, there is no return. It doesn't make sense. So this is where I started looking into Queensland, and I realized that in 2003, you could buy in Queensland of anywhere between 8 to 9% return. And I said, well, that makes sense. Yeah. So let's have a look through in Queensland. So we started looking through in Queensland quite a bit. We bought quite a bit in Queensland. And then fortunately, we look back and we sort of say 2004, 2005, 6, that Queensland had massive level of growth with exactly the same philosophy. The investors sort of looking back and investors sort of saying that, well, the numbers make a lot more sense in Queensland as such. You know, it's a suburban 20, 25 kilometers away. You've got all the infrastructure, the cafe culture. So there is nothing wrong infrastructure-wise, so to speak. Yeah. It's just that the numbers are much better. Now, that took a hit, again, all the way in 2008, 2009, where Queensland has started to look only about 3.5% return. But amazingly that while New South Wales did almost nothing between 2003 to 2008, the whole market was stagnated. The stagnation by itself is that it gives an opportunity for market to stabilize. And that means that while that's sort of the population growth, which is sort of progressive growth as such, means that the demands is sort of becoming a lot more accumulated as such. So 2008 onward, that New South Wales started to increase a bit. And then again, it sort of went through in cycle. So if I look back to it and we sort of say that, wow, so market goes up, market goes down, market stays a stagnation, right? So the standard thing in 1999, when I bought the very first property, was in Ingleburn, a very simple 3-bedroom, nothing extraordinary. I know
the area very well. Yeah.
For about 120 odd grand, right? Yeah. And I remember I sat down in 1999. I said, Aaron, I hear all this sort of the expert view that every 7 to 10 years the market doubles, right? So if I do the maths in advance, this is 1999. So 2009, 2019, my $120,000 property will become $240 and will become $480, right? And I said, no way Campbelltown will ever be $500,000 property. Why not? I could not visualize this at that stage. And the reason I couldn't visualize is because in 1999, you could buy almost this North Sydney sort of semis in sort of mid-5 and sort of early 6. So for me to try to visualize that Campbelltown would be the same price at North Sydney at a point of time, I said, there is no way. There's something wrong with the maths. And I go back and I sort of say that, well, this is 2021. And if I sort of say that particular property, which I still own, is about $650, you would say, oh, that makes sense. You know what? I mean, what can you get at $650 in Sydney? That seems to be a cheap property as such. Yeah. Whereas say in 1999, I couldn't visualize. I think that's what the trick is, that what I've learned over a period of time, a couple of things. Number one is that it's a long game.
Yeah, well said.
You also sort of play, I suppose, the time and not so much the timing of the market. Yeah. Right? Saying this, that while you play the long game and you look into the time, you look into some of the fundamental. A fundamental which I always followed, and that sort of seemed to work, is any investment has a return component. Yeah. And what's the return? So if the inflation is about 2 to 3%, the standard thing, as we sort of say, $1 for $1,000, right? The standard 5% return, which is for a $500,000 property, you get $500 as a rental return. That gives you 5.2% return. That's the formula that I sort of always followed, saying that, well, around 5% return. If I get a bit higher than 5%, great. And if it is much lower than 5%, there has to be a logic why I'm buying it. Is it a manufactured growth? Is it something which has got a rezoning facilities? Is it something that I can utilize over a period of time? But as part of natural course, assuming 2 to 3% is inflation, that around 5% sort of to some extent. Now, then you add a whole lot of complexity around it, right? You add the sophistication. You sort of say that, well, let's take the cafe culture with it. Yeah. Let's take some of the infrastructure behind it. Let's take the population growth. Let's take the rezoning. So you can add away all of those different facilities, but as long as we follow that sort of fundamental, that seemed to have worked out pretty well. The other thing which sort of worked out very well in my case, in hindsight, none of those things I had master planned.
And this is why we can look back at your portfolio and go, this is this is what worked well, because hindsight's a wonderful thing.
That's right.
Going through it, you probably were freaking out that you're buying your first property and probably overpaying for it, right? So,
my dad still remember that when I bought that at 120, my initial debate was with my father. My father said, buy this, right? And I still remember I didn't want to buy any property. This is 1999, right? So I didn't want to buy any property. So I was debating with him that this is overpriced. And I still remember I sort of said, oh, look, it's not 120. It really should be 115. And my father, with all of his wisdom, he sort of says, no, buy it. You should be okay. I look back and I said, does $5,000 make a difference? I suppose, Aaron, the other thing which worked out very well is the diversification.
Yeah, right.
As a sophisticated investor, is that diversification still helps. Now, one can look into it and say, what does that mean? Property by itself is a one asset class. How do you have diversification? Well, you can have the geographical diversification, right? And that's a fundamental element of success in the longer period of time. Not to buy all properties into one state if there is an opportunity. Buy it in New South Wales, buy it in Queensland, buy it in Victoria, let it be Western Australia. And when you do it, is that you see that there are different markets at different point of time does very, very, very well. So one market, while it becomes quite overpriced, is the rest of the market which keeps your portfolio going. And then it becomes a vice versa, right? So that diversification over a period of time worked very well. So if I look forward to now and we sort of say, where to?
Yeah.
And this is where we get challenged, right?
Correct.
And
because it's rare that you have all property markets, because it's exactly what you're saying. Because when Sydney's down, you go to Perth, for example. When Perth's up, you can maybe look at Adelaide. But at the moment, as we go to air, every single property market in Australia is on fire. So it's an unusual one where we've got all the markets kind of firing on all cylinders, and not having that kind of one state's up and one state's down. So
you are absolutely 100%. And, with 22 years of experience, is that I look back and I say, this is the first time that I've seen in my personal experience that every single market is crazy at the moment, right? They're all sort of increasing, right? They're all increasing. Now, we always look back to the science behind it and we say, why? And we always try to look back to the logic behind it and we say, why? Yes, we take the history as a learning lesson. And we sort of look back and we say, what is different in this sort of the cycle compared to any of the other cycle? Well, the fundamental thing is that we never had virus before, right? So this is, if we say something which is a true once in a generation, hopefully once in a generation event, that is this virus that we have. And again, we look back to the history. We look back to the Spanish flu as an example. We look back to the plague as an example, right? Many years ago, right? But even if we look back to it, we sort of see that many of those sort of the worldwide calamities, so to speak, all those being followed with a generation of affluence and a generation of success. What's the logic? The logic is various fold, right? So government, if you look through, is that there's quite a bit of funding being imposed by the government, right? I mean, to start with, all of those line of credit, so to speak, being provided to all those different banks and saying that up until June, that you've got almost a free access to it of all of those sort of the accessibility of the funding. So what that means is that the market is quite liquid at the moment. There is just so much accessible funding at the moment, right? APRA hasn't sort of opened with the biggest stick as yet. So that means all the sort of a second tier and sort of the almost sort of the private banks are sort of coming along quite a bit as well. So consumers seem to have quite a bit of choice at the moment, right? And then you sort of look through and you sort of say, well, the interest rate, of course it is. When we say historically low, it's lowest ever, right? And I think the last time we had an increase of interest rate of some crazy about 9-10 years ago.
Correct.
Right. And
for as long as I've been doing this, I've never known the rates to go up.
10 years.
Yeah, great.
Right. And you look back and you say 10 years of interest rate, right? And that by itself has an impact, right? And significant impact. Then you look into the unemployment side of it. And in the middle of the virus, we spoke about the double digit of the unemployment and the latest number is 5.1%.
Crazy. Yeah.
And one argues is that your full unemployment is about 4.6, 4.7. You always have some people who are sort of looking for work and in between and parental leave and all the rest of it, right? So 4.6, 4.7 is our full unemployed. So we're pretty much fully employed at the moment, right? That's there. And then you look into the government and you sort of see that all this infrastructure, sort of the cost and the investment that the government is sort of doing quite a bit. Yes, he had away all the job keepers and all the sort of the excess cash that everyone else has. So it's a perfect combination of interest rate being so low. unemployment being so high, there is so much liquidity in the market, and then you've got all of those funding opportunities being available as well. And yes, there was a decline of market at a point of time. There was a stagnation of the point of time, right? So a combination of it means that this is a perfect storm of the market to do crazy as they are. Where to, though?
Yeah, exactly. That's the question.
To?
Yeah.
And this is where one got to be a little bit sort of conservative, right? This is where got to be conservative. What I'm being very, very cautious is that some of the younger investors, as an example, that who haven't seen the interest rate being 5 and 6, and your parents, as he said, in double digit as such, is that one got to be a little bit careful. So if you look back into some of the 5 years sort of the fixed rate and almost the 4 years fixed rate, they tend to be sort of saying that we would like to go a little bit up, right? That's the first sign. And then you sort of go through the second and third, right? I mean, do I really see RBA to increase the interest rate over the next 6 months, 9 months? I question it. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, the economy has got such a butterfly effect that you never know what the end outcome is, but unlikely, right? Yeah. Do I really see the individual banks to be increasing the interest rate by themselves a lot earlier? I would arguably say yes. That's
exactly what has probably come out just recently, saying the banks are going to start to move out of cycle.
Yeah.
On their rates, independently.
And that's the impact, right? I mean, it's the profitability of the bank, right? Because some of the cost as they have received as almost free from the government as a subsidy, some of those sort of ran out. So the banks are sort of profit-making entities, and that's where the profit sort of comes in. So I think that, yes, we've got a growth left. How much is the growth left? Is that one probably argues that New South Wales perhaps is just a little bit more sort of advanced into that growth curve, and one sort of argues that Queensland is sort of perhaps a little bit more beginning of that growth curve. Melbourne is a funny one, right? Because you sort of open and you close, and you open and you close, right? And with the vaccine and the virus and everything else. But Melbourne sort of more or less seems to be almost closer to New South Wales as well. Then we look into Western Australia as an example, and we say that, wow, it sort of seems to be boom and bust to some extent. So you get this 20% growth and then followed by 20% sort of a drop as such, right? So one got to be a little bit sort of careful in my view with Western Australia. So I think there is a bit of growth left with New South Wales. Definitely there is. Queensland, in my opinion, there seems to be a significant amount of growth left as well. But you know what? Again, coming back to the history, is that the property market always seems to have a habit of always overdoing it and become overpriced, and then it sort of decreases a bit of prices, it stays stagnant. So how long? I mean, again, no one knows, right? New South Wales, whether it is another 6-9 months growth left. Queensland, I would like to think that there's probably at least a couple of years or so growth being left. And Melbourne perhaps is sort of more or less similar as sort of in New South Wales as such. That's the general prediction. Now, saying this, I'm an accountant. I always give a disclaimer, right? So what is the disclaimer? Is that if you were to ask me this question about, say, 3 months ago, I would have probably had a little bit of different answer. If you were to ask me this question about a year ago, right in the middle of the COVID, I would have a complete different answer, right? Absolutely. So some of the things change.
Yep. Absolutely. And there was, going exactly what you said was, asked this question 12 months ago. I don't think anyone could have predicted what the property. I mean, there was maybe a couple of buyers agents that did, but no one could have actually predicted the outcome from COVID to be where the property market is today, which has made it so hard to then forward plan and go, what happens if the borders open up? Because they're saying that will push up prices again, because the Australian property market's been seen as a safe haven, as a high performing asset as well. Really, really hard to say. But from a personal perspective as well, Munzurul, like, where do you go to from next as a if you kind of look at this as a lens as an investor? Where do you kind of look to next?
I think as an investor side of it is that it all depends on your personal goals and objectives, right? Yeah, okay. So I'm a real big fan saying that as an investor, when any of our clients comes in and say, what do we buy? I mean, we're not buyers agents, we're not financial advisors, so we sort of technically can't say buy in New South Wales and Queensland, and we don't. What we do is that we provide the facts and figures, and what we sort of say, what are the facts and figures? And the first thing which we sort of say is that, well, what's your budget? And before you sort of even go into a particular area and buying it, is that sit down with a mortgage broker, right? Have a look through and yes, provide some rounding parameters, so to speak, that, well, I'm receiving about 4% return, or maybe I'm receiving about 3.5% gross return. And on the basis of this, on the basis of my income, what's my maximum borrowing abilities, right? Yeah. And very often one gets directed by the borrowing abilities, right? So let's say, as an example, I'm sitting with you and you sort of say, Munzurul, your limit is about 500 grand. grand, then I get rather limited with that 500 grand. And then I sort of say, well, what can I buy in New South Wales for 500? If I'm sort of buying a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom apartment in a very suburban area, as opposed to if I'm buying it all the way to, say, Brisbane, a reasonably nice house on about 25, 30 kilometres away, 3-bedroom, double lock-up garage, a bit of a backyard, which one does have more prospect over a period of time, particularly if there is a land at the end that one can do a granny flat or subdivision, corner block, all of those things, right? So I get more inclined towards more suburban Brisbane as such. But if I'm sitting with yourself and you say, Munzurul, the sky's the limit, you've got about $2 million sort of a budget, right? Then I sort of say that, well, what is my goal? What is my objective? Why am I looking at this particular investment? What's my exit plan? Is it capital growth? Is it revenue generation? Is it more in terms of I see that as a business venture, so to speak, that I sort of renovate, construct or development as such? On the basis of all of the above and a lot more, then I'll make the decision, right? In the sense that if I'm sort of looking at, capital growth, then I would probably say, well, you really can't beat Sydney, right? I mean, when the border opened, as he said, all the expats start to come in with lots of cash in their hand. Where do the expats come? We generalizing, but it's New South Wales and Victoria, right? And then they sort of spread everywhere else. So New South Wales Sydney will always have that sort of a flavor. So if I'm looking at purely growth, with sort of income not such a concern, then I sort of say, well, perhaps Sydney is a good option. If I'm looking at in terms of my risk side of it, I would probably argue that, well, rather than having one property of 2 mil, can I break it down into 2 or 3 properties into sort of the
question I was going to ask you, like, do you go all in and buy the one at 1 mil or 1 or 2 mil versus do you break that up over a few?
That's right. And exactly, depending on the circumstances, right? And depending on the age bracket, depending on where you are and depending on what the objective is. One does argue that, while you break it down into, say, 2 or 3 as such, is that you've got 3 tenants to start with, right, in 3 properties. So that means, again, your risk is being mitigated and you're being diversified to some extent with that element of the risk. So you don't have tenants in one property while you still have on the other 2. Whereas one is a bit of all go in or all go out. And that's a view, right? But on the other side is that you also say is that sometimes quality comes in with price, right? And always quality comes in with price. And then you sort of say that, well, the reason why those properties are 2 mil is that there is a reason why those properties. So I think there is a time and place for everyone, right? A time and place for each property. So you always look into the budget first, and then on the budget you get, I suppose, limited to some extent or directed to some extent, and then you look into the ideal property. Now, again, any of those comments are not financial advice, but if I were to buy it, I look back into myself and I say, even in my journey of 22 years, you know what, things sort of over a period of time changed, built, became more sophisticated in the sense that the first number of properties that I bought, I look back and I say, I really didn't know what I was doing, right? I didn't, I bought villas, I bought sort of standard houses, I bought this. But now, after that many years, is that I only try to buy properties where, number one, the numbers sort of within reasonableness make sense, that a certain level of return, but most importantly, that there is a value proposition to it. There is something one can do. So whether it's a corner block that you can subdivide and create a second block.
So what I call like an X factor.
Yeah. So that's right. So it's a manufacturing growth potential, right? Because to me, that opportunity of manufacturing growth, whether it's sort of subdivide, build something, granny flat, second dwelling, demolish 1 into 4 and all the rest of it, right, is that for you to have that abilities, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to do it.
Correct.
But the fact that you have that opportunity, that by itself to me is almost an option.
Yeah.
And that option by itself has got a sellable value attached to it. So you can sell that, not so much the dream, you can sell that business proposition, so to speak, to the next investor who sort of comes in saying that, yes, that's the potential. We haven't utilized the potential, but you as a builder or builder to be, these are the potential that you do. And then we look back, Aaron, and we sort of say, the old saying, the land and the land and the land, it sort of is still there. We look back and we sort of say the old saying of the location and the location and the location is still there. So you look into the land, you look into the location, and you look into the underlying science behind it. And then in the longer period of time, you sort of say that arguably any action is, one argues, that potential is better than no action.
Yeah, well said.
In the longer term.
Mate, thank you so much. We're gonna continue this discussion very shortly, but on that point, I mean, you've gone through like the market, we've gone through, reflected on your journey as well, on the Australian property market and its ebbs and flows over the last, say, 20 odd years as well. So, Munzurul, thank you very much for your insights. Thank you very much for your tips as well. We're going to continue as being a 2-part series with Munzurul, but I hope you found our first episode super helpful. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Australian Property Investment Podcast, and we'll be back with round 2 with Munzurul very shortly. I'm your host, Aaron-Christie David. Thank you very much.